Today's presentation will walk through the life of a user story from idea inception through delivery back to the product owner. Using Scrum principles, we'll explore different processes of creating, maintaining, and developing a story, including best practices for documentation, process flow, and acceptance criteria. We'll be talking about removing complexities and simplifying the process, as well as how version 1 supports the complete user story lifecycle. Today's presenter is Katya Sullivan. She's a product specialist at version 1. Katya has experience in transitioning from waterfall through rough and then into agile practices. She has experience in managing requirements and performing as a Scrum Master on NASA's Integrated Enterprise Management Project. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Katya.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and get started. Again, I encourage you to ask any questions. We'll be happy to answer those towards the end or even throughout this presentation. So within the Agile framework of project management, creating and managing requirements or user stories is different than in traditional project management. In traditional project management, requirements are captured, and then the project manager would begin the time-consuming job of creating a task breakdown for the entire project. Then the project is typically planned around these activities. From the Agile point of view, the time spent on this would be viewed as wasteful. Within the Agile approach, we keep the focus on the priority of features. We may break down larger features into smaller ones, but that's as far as you go. So an Agile project management process it is a little bit different, and in this webinar we're going to go over the lifespan of that requirement. So first off, let's look at the overall timeline of features on the 3-month release and how much detail is captured for requirements at each interval. James Shore described it like this. At the start of the project, the overall vision is defined and epics or very large features are created. About 3 months out, you define the major features to deliver with enough detail to estimate for release planning. 6 weeks out from implementing the features, well, that's when they should become stories with enough details to plan into an iteration. And then 2 weeks before implementing a story is when all the details need to be defined. As you can see, the amount of details you capture increases the closer a feature gets to an iteration. There's no need to document all the information up front, which is good because, as everybody knows, things change. So how do you get from that vision to a working product with requirements on an Agile project? Well, when it comes to an Agile project, first of all, what is going to change regarding requirements? Well, the way you capture and document requirements, which requires less detail up front and a lot more conversations to drive out the details. The way you prioritize requirements, which will be based on value to the business and risk. The way you plan the activities around that user story. And finally, the way you deliver the features to the product owner. So let's take a look at what changes when capturing and documenting requirements. So you have a transition from a large work breakdown structure at a task level to a feature breakdown structure at a story level, comparatively. If you have a set of requirements on a traditional project, again, the project manager is going to be, use up a lot of time creating a task breakdown for the entire project that changes all the time. So we see that, as I mentioned earlier, as wasteful activities within the Agile framework. With an Agile approach, we keep the focus on the priority of the features. Again, we may break down these larger features into smaller ones, but that is, again, as far as you go. It still allows you to gain insight into when the project will be completed. We'll touch on this later, but first let's look at what a story is. In the Agile framework, you have to transition from that large requirement document with all the details up front to what we call user stories, which focuses on the users of the system and how they will interact with it. So how a story is implemented is more flexible, and it's up to the team to determine. Agile teams that are just starting out and are fairly immature in terms of practical experience often start out using index cards to document requirements or user stories. The cards make it easier for teams to visually understand what all is involved in creating a system and allows them to prioritize and plan, ultimately to track a progress during an iteration. So as teams advance maturity, they'll move on to tools such as version 1 to help manage their stories, releases, and iterations. Bill Wake, who is the author of Extreme Programming Explored, suggests an INVEST acronym as a simple way to remember and assess whether or not a user story is well formed. And what that means is user stories should be as independent as possible. User stories are not a contract. They are not detailed specifications. They're reminders of features for the team to discuss and to collaborate to clarify the details near the time of development. User stories should be valuable to the user or the owner of the solution. So they should be written in user language. They should be features, not tasks. User stories need to be estimatable. They, in other words, need to provide enough information to estimate them without being too detailed. And we'll go over estimating in just a couple minutes. So user stories should be small, not too small, but not too big. And what we mean by that is a user story should be able to be completed within an iteration. That's what we mean by not too big and not too small. And finally, user stories need to be worded in a way that's testable. In other words, not too subjective, and to provide clear details of how the user story will be tested. The concept of user stories has its roots as one of the main tenets of extreme programming. In simple terms, user stories represent an effective means of gathering requirements from the customer, which is roughly akin to use cases. So what's a story, and how are they different from traditional requirements? Well, a story is a requirement or feature of the product owner would like to see in the product. In User Stories Applied, Mike Cohn suggests a more formal approach to writing user stories. He suggests this format as I, user role, want to achieve a goal so that we can get some value. So each story has three parts: the role, the goal, and the reason. An example would be, as a buyer, I want to add a book to my order so that I can buy multiple books at one time. So the role defines the user of the system, and depending on the user, there may be different ways each one interacts with the system and multiple stories to address the various roles. The function or the feature is what the business owner wants the system to do, and the value is critical as it tells them why this feature is important and what value it adds to the system. So a story is ultimately a promise to have a conversation with your product owner to discuss the details of how the story will be implemented. This helps ensure that the requirement is captured at a high level, is feature-oriented, and covers who, what, and why. So some stories will initially be larger and have to be broken down into smaller stories. Take, for instance, the story of a buyer wanting to pay for their order. Well, this could be broken down into smaller stories: pay by credit or pay by PayPal account. And even the credit story can be broken down further based on the types of credit cards that will be accepted. Breaking stories into smaller ones allows the team to ensure that that story, once again, can be completed in one iteration, and it helps make them independent of one another. With the story, you also have to have acceptance criteria or conditions of satisfaction, which state how the developers will know they have successfully coded the feature and how the business owner will test and accept the feature as complete. Here's some examples for the story where a buyer wants to be able to search for books. The acceptance criteria defines how they can search, what to do if multiple books are found, and how to sort. The nice thing is that these will easily convert to tests that can be executed to ensure that the story was implemented correctly. Okay, so one of the benefits of distinct user stories versus a work breakdown structure is that the product owner can now prioritize the features they want to see in the product, and the team then determines the best way to complete the stories when they are worked on. So let's look at how stories are prioritized on an Agile project. The entire list of stories is called the product backlog. Once you've identified the stories for the project, the team can work with the product owner to prioritize this backlog. There are several things to consider when determining that priority. First and foremost, the highest value features should be prioritized at the top. These are the must-have features that the product will need to be able to release. And by continually focusing on the top priority items, you ensure that you're developing the features your customers will use. And if you run into a situation where you need to release without all the features, it's the low or the nice-to-have features that will be dropped. The next thing to consider when prioritizing is the risk associated to the stories. Does the story require new technology that the team's not familiar with, or is there a need to complete an integration point with another product early on to ensure the success? Well, you get the picture. This is why it's important that the team have a voice in determining the priority of the stories. Finally, things change. So that's why there's continuous planning and prioritizing of the backlog. take into account new features, changes, and removal of features that are no longer required. Your product owner or product management team will be critical in keeping the backlog up to date and prioritized throughout the project. So now that we've prioritized backlog, the next step is applying an estimate to them. This will help later when we need to determine how much we can complete in a given time frame or within that iteration. In the traditional approach, the estimates were originally given in numbers of days or hours. The Agile approach focuses on estimating the size of a story because it has more accurate and it's more accurate and quicker to generate. So let's look at an example of that. Think about dogs and their different sizes. If you were asked to tell me how much each of these dogs weighs, you'd more than likely will not be 100% accurate. But so by just looking at dog, it's hard to tell its weight. But what if I asked you to tell me what group they fit in based on small, medium, or large? That would be a lot easier, and you don't have to know the exact weight. You could, by looking at them and comparing them to one another, determine the overall size. So you can now group the dogs into different sizes of small, medium, and large, and then associate numbers to the sizes. We'll call these numbers dog points. So we'll assign the small dogs as 1 dog point, and then the medium dogs are twice as large as the small ones, so we'll assign them 2 dog points. And then the large dogs are twice as big as the medium dogs, so we'll assign them 4 dog points to each one of those. So your relative complexity or relative size from one another is what's most important in estimating. So estimating stories is similar. Using story points instead of dog points, you assign a number to a story based on the size and effort to implement. We'll use the same pointing scheme we use for the dogs, 1, 2, and 4. This is valuable information that's going to help us down the road during planning. So now that we have our stories prioritized and estimated, let's look at how to use this information to plan an iteration. First of all, a release is comprised of several iterations, depending on your process and your organization culture. An iteration is typically a 1 to 4 week time frame in which several stories are completed. All the tasks necessary to analyze, design, code, and test the stories are scheduled and worked on by the team, so that at the end of the iteration, you have a working, tested product. In other words, you have completed the software development lifecycle for each feature within that iteration. To manage a release effectively, you have to continue to look at the project constraints as you do with traditional approach. So let's look at the difference in how the triple constraints in schedule, cost and scope, or features are addressed from traditional versus agile projects. In a traditional project setting, a customer will typically demand which features they want delivered at a fixed cost and schedule. This often causes projects to go over budget and beyond the deadline and out of scope, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. With an agile approach, the cost or timeline can be fixed, while the features remain flexible, allowing the project to remain within allocated cost and timeline, ensuring delivery of the most important features. Remember back to our initial discussion on changing requirements. By always keeping the product backlog updated and prioritized based on value and risk, you have a better chance of getting the features completed that are essential to releasing the product. Think about all the past projects where you delivered features that were rarely, if ever, used. Wouldn't it be great to deliver what's absolutely essential and cut out all the fluff? So let's look at an example of how planning is different in Agile if you fix scope and schedule. If a product owner comes to the team and says, "Team, we only have 1 month to deliver features for product X. How much can we get done by then?" I'm going to introduce a new term called velocity, which is key to helping the team determine this. Remember earlier we estimated the stories and story points. These values are now used to tell us how much a team can complete in an iteration, and that's called velocity, their rate of delivery. When teams start out, they're probably not going to know their velocity until roughly 2 to 3 iterations out. So at first, you're really making somewhat of an educated guess based on your skills, abilities, experience, how difficult the stories are. So velocity will start to surface, which will be very helpful for planning and being able to respond to customer questions like this. So let's say the team's velocity is 10 points. Based on what's in the product backlog, which is prioritized, remember, all but 6 of the features can be completed in a month if each iteration is 2 weeks. If the product owner says that absolutely all the features are needed to release, you can tell them, well, no problem. With the current velocity of 10, we can deliver all 3 features in 3 iterations. or 1.5 months. With either approach, the team can better predict how much they can get done by using their velocity. So now the team has committed to a body of work for that iteration, and the product owner has accepted that commitment. It's now time for the team to continue their planning in detail, which means that they're going to be creating the activities for those user stories. During planning, openly discussing development tasks gives all team members a view that will take place while implementing the story selected for the iteration. So during that discussion, they can help each other clarify and improve their development plan and discuss lesser-known areas of code, databases, etc., to help other team members learn and become more productive in their development. So now it's time to see this process in action. I'm going to jump into version 1 to demonstrate how this process works electronically. This is my shameful vision of version 1. So in version 1, we follow that same process from product and release planning into iteration planning. And then we're further going to go into tracking and review. So when we look at that product backlog, in product planning, remember this is where the product owner is introducing these backlog items or these features, and you're putting as much information as you need to at the time to them. So there are several ways to introduce in version 1 a backlog item. If you just have, or a story, if you just have a general idea, you can add a story in line. For the purposes of this webinar, I have a Scrum template introduced into version 1, so I'll be using Scrum terminology. Just keep in mind that a backlog item is the same thing as a story for those of you who might not understand that. But let's say that I'm going to introduce a new backlog item, and I do have some information, for example, the user story. So I'm going to go ahead and add a backlog item to my backlog. Let's call it update RMA. We know what project it's going into. We don't know yet what sprint it's going to or what team is going to do it, but we do have a user story that was submitted to us. So we can go ahead and put that in our description. Oftentimes people use the user story as the title, but for the purposes of having a database that allows you to slice and dice data, we want to keep that different. Also, in the case of you might need a different naming convention for the title, you want to keep that different. Also, we want to go ahead, if we have an estimate, put that estimate to that story. So let's say the story is a 2. Any other information we have available we can populate, but all we are required to populate is actually the title and what project the story is going into. So we're going to select OK, and that story is actually going to be introduced into the bottom of our backlog. You can see it right here. In version 1, we can rank and prioritize these stories by dragging and dropping them to the top of the list. So I'm going to drag and drop them to the top of the list where things are not in the sprint. You notice that I do have some items in here that are currently in the sprint for visibility purposes. So now I have my story in the top of the list is prioritized. That's going to let the teams know that that is one of the most important features that needs to be created for the next sprint or iteration. When we go into our sprint planning now, we have our sprint, and we're going to put and plant this middle sprint, month C, second half. But the first thing, again, the team wants to know is that velocity, if they've already had historical velocity. They're not new. We do have some context-sensitive reporting, like velocity trend report, where I can pull up and the team can see that on average, it looks like the team is delivering about 26 story points worth of work each iteration. So the team now knows that that's about our capacity. We don't want to overcommit. We don't want to undercommit, so we're going to stick to 26 points. So remember how the product owner had ranked or prioritized that product backlog in the product planning area. Now that same product backlog is in the same order, and it's going to help, for the teams. It's going to help to remove ambiguity for the teams. So the teams know right from the get-go to grab items from the top of the list and go ahead and drag and drop them into the sprint bucket, or we can multi-select several items if we choose to, and move those to the sprint that we're planning. And when you notice that our sprint bucket is giving us an indication of how many story points and other metrics that we have in this sprint, we're going to go ahead and stick to the 25 points that we have and continue our detailed planning. So we talked about having just enough information that you can estimate and make these stories independent. Now we're going to go ahead and do that task breakdown that typically in Waterfall we'd see way at the very beginning of a planning process. So in version 1, we can go right into detailed planning and choose that sprint that we're going to plan right now. And start breaking down these user stories into tasks and tests. We call that in version 1 planning the backlog item. So when we plan the backlog item, envision a room full of the team members, which is usually a cross-functional team. And they're going to start collaborating and talking about what kind of tasks and tests it's going to take to create this feature. Most teams will go ahead and add their tests first because they already have that acceptance criteria that I talked about earlier. So let's go ahead and add some tests here. One of those tests is going to be, well, then to be able to establish whether we've accomplished our feat here, we need to be able to access RMA by using the order number. And while the team is talking, we can go ahead and whoever is driving that day can go ahead and document any kind of discussions that are going on. So we want to give as much information to QA as possible. We might go ahead and we might know who's going to go ahead and do this test. We might not. But we also want to give a detailed estimate of how long, on average, it should take to complete this test, regardless of who did it. So let's say the team says, well, this is about a 4-hour test. Okay. So what else do we have to do? So we can continue adding new tests if we want to. Let's go ahead and add a second test for, again, that acceptance criteria. And go ahead and assign that to somebody and put in that detailed estimate. This should only be about a 2-hour test. And you can continue adding as many acceptance tests as you want. Many organizations are going to create acceptance tests at the feature level. Or the user story level, but other organizations create tests for the task level. So that's a corporate culture item or issue that your organizations or your team should decide on. And it just also depends on the complexity of that user story. Sometimes it just makes sense to test it at the user story level. Other times, if it's very complex, and you have longer iterations as you get more mature, you might want to test more often. Again, in Agile, we want to test often and test completely. So let's say we're just going to do those 2 tests. Now we're going to start adding the tasks. So the team can start collaborating to say, what's it going to take to make this update RMA feature? Well, first we have to probably design the component. So just put our design component. And, as the team is talking and discussing and collaborating, they might come up with some ideas, and there's some additional documentation that we want to add in here so that we have a clear picture as a team what needs to be designed and how it needs to be designed. Oftentimes there are attachments attached to the user story to help you do that. Perhaps we don't know who's going to do this task yet. Sometimes teams grab work as they go. Sometimes teams assign in their planning, and sometimes it's just a hybrid. But once again, we do have to put a detail estimate where the team decides, on average, on any given day, it should take probably, say, 6 hours to complete this task. We select OK and New. And we continue adding more tasks, like we have to build the component, for example. Go ahead and build that component, and we're going to brainstorm back and forth and determine what the build means, what any kind of special considerations, any dependencies we might have to build that component. And again, put that detailed estimate in here. Let's go ahead and assign this to somebody. And put a detailed estimate. Let's say the build should take 8 hours. And then select OK and New. And finally, the team says, well, we need to have a code review. And we can go ahead and put that code review information in here as usual. Go ahead and put our description. Perhaps at this time, though, with code review, we want to do some pair programming. In version 1, you can assign several people or multiple people to tasks and even user stories, so responsibility for user stories. So let's just go ahead and say that we're going to do some pair programming between Bruno and Danny. And but it's still, this is about a 4-hour task. So we're going to say OK. And now we're looking at this list of our tasks and tests. And in version 1, you can, again, rank these by dragging and dropping them in the appropriate order they should be completed, and add any additional information that we need to update RMA. Once that planning is complete for that user story, we continue going on down the list to plan out the rest of the stories. Now, planning sessions, I get asked often how long a planning session should take, and you get better at it as you move along. Typically for, let's say, a 2-week sprint, planning is about a half a day, and that's part of your sprint. Your sprint planning is part of your sprint. So is your review. Okay, so moving on with the day in the life of this user story of Update RMA, what happens next after all the planning? It's time to actually go and develop. So while we're developing, we have that list of tasks and tests. We were talking about index cards and showed some pictures of sticky notes. In small and immature teams, we usually see a whiteboard where we have those index cards with those stories. You notice I have a couple of defects here too. And then we have those sticky notes with those tasks and tests for those user stories. So version 1 offers this task board that is basically an electronic whiteboard. As somebody comes in, let's say I'm coming in to start designing this component. It's not assigned to anybody, so I can go ahead and sign up for it. And I can just drag it over to in progress and continue on my day with my coding efforts. And then at the end of the day, you know, we said it was going to be a 6-hour task. I perhaps might have worked on it for 4 hours today. So I'm going to go ahead and say, well, I worked on it for 4 hours. We said it was going to be a 6-hour task. You would think I'd only have 2 hours left, but I think we underestimated that a little bit. So I'm going to say we have about 4 hours left. You always have to maintain that to-do because that's where your burn down comes from. And then you continue on to the next day, and each team member is grabbing those sticky notes or those tasks to put them in the appropriate area. In terms of the user story, also has to pass muster through your stand-up. So let me switch back to a previous sprint here and pull up the stand-up dashboard. Every day in the stand-up, the team is going to address one another to talk about these activities and the features. This is the collaborative part of Agile where you're constantly talking back and forth to one another, getting ideas, pair programming perhaps, making sure that everybody's on the same page and helping one another out, which naturally brings into cross-training. But let's say we're in our stand-up and we have our stand-up dashboard. You notice we do have that burn down. Remember that to-do or that detailed estimate that we were putting in. That's what's going to determine what's remaining to do in our sprint, because we're concerned about how many hours we have left to work and what tasks are remaining to complete. So we see those tasks remaining to complete in our task board. We do see a cumulative flow by status by default in our stand-up dashboard as well. So we have our tasks, and as each member talks to the team or addresses the team, we can go ahead and highlight that member for a little more visibility. You know, you're answering those 3 main questions, unless you've customized your stand-up for more questions. You know, you're asking, you know, what have you done since your last meeting, and what are you doing now, and are there any impediments or any issues that you have to deal with? You know, let's talk that out and fix it, or, you know, table it, or whatever we have to do. So that task, that update RMA task, it's not on this sprint because I moved to a sprint that actually has activity, is being moved along that process from none to in progress to complete. And a team member, whoever's working on that, is continuously updating that documentation if they need to, depending on your culture, and preparing it for testing. So now let's talk about testing. So as we do have that test board available, so as those tasks begin to be completed for this update RMA, the QA is keeping an eye to make sure that it, you know, when it's ready to be able to test, and then the QA goes in to test that feature or that work item. Keep in mind that we are always trying to complete that software development life cycle within that iteration. That is the goal. We want to have a deliverable, a working feature to offer back to the product owner. So let's say that we have now completed the iteration. Time's up, and we have done all the work we're going to do. Now it's time to do our sprint review, and now we get to offer that deliverable. So we get to say, okay, product owner, go to the end of the sprint. Okay, product owner, here is, in this case, ship order. This is what it looks like, and this is what it smells like, and this is what it tastes like, and is this what you wanted? Because we think this is what you wanted. We've been collaborating. The product owner will say, oh my gosh, you guys rock. That's exactly what I wanted. Let's go ahead and close that item. Done and over with. We don't want to see it again. And here, product owner, here's add shipping notes, and this is what it looks like, and this is what, you know, look at the cool whiz-bang buttons on there, and the customer's going to love this. And the product owner says, you know, that's pretty cool too. Let's close that one. In version 1, you have several other options. We don't like to see this. And remember, these next two options are the exception, not the rule, to Agile software development. One option is product owner, here is a feature or a user story that you wanted. It was quick status check, and we were unable to complete this, for this reason, that reason, whatever reason. So you need to push that off into the next iteration. So we can do that in version 1 with just dragging and dropping. Or alternatively, product owner, we didn't get this this user story completed. We tried real hard. Half the team came down with the flu. Sorry, but we just didn't get it finished. So sometimes you have to split that user story. What that means is you're actually creating 2 user stories from one. Again, this is an exception, not the rule. This is if you find your team splitting stories at the end of each iteration, that means that the first indicator is that they might be overcommitting to work or undercommitting resources. But that's something that's the visibility is going to be blatant and quick, and you're going to be able to surface what's happening and why you're not completing your project very quickly. So when we split the item in version 1, my blatant,
Shameless plug.
Shameless plug, that's the term.
Mm-hmm.
When we hit the split, all the tasks that had already burnt down, in other words, that had 0 to do, remain with the original story. But then we have a new story, and notice it has its own unique identifier. Then we can go ahead and edit it. All the tasks that still had work to do drop down to the new story automatically. And we can go ahead and put that in the next iteration or take it out of an iteration, depending on what the product owner wants to do. Because remember, the product owner is responsible for prioritizing that backlog. So we select OK, and then we can go ahead and close this original story. So those are the different options you have when you're in your sprint review and you offer that deliverable. The object, again, is to complete that life cycle and to offer a deliverable, to that product owner that is actual usable software, or to your client. Oftentimes, your product owner is your client. And then you move on to the next iteration. And again, as you are working in your iteration, you're working on a prioritized list of user stories. And you're doing the must-haves first and the could-have second and the want-to-haves last. And that is the idea of prioritizing. So basically, that is the day in the life of the user story with my shameless plug for version 1. And so I'm open up. We'll go through this pretty quickly. I'm going to open up for Q&A at this point.
Excellent. Well, we do have several questions, so we're going to go ahead and start from the beginning. The first question we had was around using story points. It says, do you only use 1, 2, and 4 story points? Therefore, do you break stories which may have 8, 13, 20, etc. down to 1, 2, and 4?
Well, okay, that's a very good question. So typically what you would see is the younger a story is, the higher the estimate is on the story points. As you could see, I was using story points of Fibonacci method here in our application in my presentation. If I'm going to put in a placeholder into my backlog, I know that, for example, at some point in time, we're going to have user documentation. I don't know what that means yet. I don't know the extent of that. I am, as a product owner, probably going to give it a very high estimate of like 100 to make it visible and kind of force me into saying, oh gosh, we got to break this down. We got to break this down. So yeah, you usually start off. If it's a feature, a high-level feature, like in the old days what we called a use case, you would start off with a large estimate and then break that feature down into smaller stories. And typically your smaller stories, again, depending on your culture and how you estimate if you're using story points, are 1, 2, 4, 5, 8, for your iterations. But before they're in the iterations are usually larger.
So we have another question kind of around that, and to do with when you split a story, how do you handle story points? Okay, so typically, and that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked that because I didn't cover that. So when we split a story, let's put this view daily call count. I'm going to do it electronically just because it's easier to show you. When I split the story, you notice that estimate, those story points, drop down to the new story. And the reason for that is because in Agile, we do not take credit for work we do not finish. Now, finish means that work is done or done.
and the team determines what done is based on that acceptance criteria, the test. So if we didn't finish the story, we don't get credit. That is, the rough of it. In version 1, you do have the option to edit those fields because there are some times that you understand exactly why you didn't finish the story, like half the team came down with the flu, but you typically would not take credit for that estimate until you achieve done.
Thank you for that. So the next question is, could you mention differences between sprint planning and release planning?
Yeah, so when we think about a large project, we have a product backlog for the large product. The idea is to break that backlog as we move into the project. The idea is to break that backlog into smaller and smaller segments because it makes it more manageable. In version 1, what I mean by that is, let me remove some filters here, and I'll show you that I have a project called the call center, which is a software development project. You notice I have 39 work items. Now that's very small for my demo data. I typically would have hundreds and hundreds of work items in here, which include both user stories and defects. To manage a backlog of hundreds and hundreds of stories is unreasonable, and most organizations do release out in segments. So like every 3 or 4 months, they will release out to, especially in production organization environment, they'll release out to the public, as version 1 does. We release on a quarterly basis out to the public. So what you're trying to do is make that backlog smaller. So in version 1, for example, we have 2 releases under call center. Release 1, when I drop down to release 1 in the project tree, notice now I'm down to 26 work items. So I have made that backlog smaller and more manageable. And then we go even further into our iterations. And so we see several iterations typically in a release, and we see several releases in a project. So that kind of is the purpose of that, is breaking that backlog smaller and smaller.
Very good. And I think part of this next question kind of falls into that is most often than not, user stories would need further elaboration for folks that are actually designing and coding them. How do you manage that?
Well, okay, so yeah, another premise in Agile, okay, so this comes to our corporate or our organizational structure. Typically in Waterfall or traditional organizations, we have siloed organizations. We have a QA department, we have a dev department, we have a BA department. In Agile framework, we create cross-functional teams. So a team, you typically don't want it more than 10 people, but a team would consist of perhaps 1 or 2 BAs and 2 or 3 developers and 1 or 2 QA, maybe even a technical writer and a Scrum Master in Scrum, for example. So you have that cross-functional team. So when you are starting to plan and get into estimating, you have that group, that cross-functional group in there collaborating from all angles. And as a result, you end up doing a lot of cross-training.
And then also the tasks are associated with the story too when you get more granular.
Yeah, so tasks are associated directly to one user story. So a user story can have multiple tasks, but if you find yourself creating a task that applies to several user stories, then you have to repeat that task because it's a different action.
Okay. Next question we have is, what would you present to management who expects to see a list of major milestones in a work plan that can be approved prior to the start of a project?
Okay, so if you have an experienced Agile team, this is very difficult to do for people who are new to Agile because you don't know what that velocity is. If you have experienced teams, you can go ahead and put that team together in a room and determine a very loose velocity and break down your milestones. Milestones in Agile are really your iterations. Each iteration you have a deliverable. Milestones in traditional usually meant something going from planning to development and coding to development to build, or to QA. But since we're completing that software development life cycle in Agile, our milestones would be each iteration. So you would determine that velocity and then break down that velocity into how much, what your rate of delivery is per iteration and offer, say each iteration we can offer this much in delivery.
Okay. Okay, we have quite a few questions, so I'm just trying to go through and pick out some good ones. So we are using the team edition of version 1, not enterprise. With everything that you went over, is that also available in team?
Yeah, so team does have that same software development lifecycle with the exception of review. Team, version 1 team is intended for basically one team working on one project. Enterprise scales up to allow, many teams to many projects. There are different security measures in enterprise. The reporting in enterprise is much more robust. There's like over 60 CAN reports. I would recommend, if you wanted to see more differences between team and enterprise, to contact your account rep, and let's have a conversation about that.
So basically, all that you showed today, is that mostly available in team?
Mostly, except for the review process, because again, the team is not going to review, is not going to offer deliverable back to a large, enterprise level in the team edition.
Okay. The next question we have is, we do an internal demo at the end of each iteration to show what we've developed and also provide release notes to customers. Would you show how to view, close, and completed tasks?
Absolutely. So in some of the reports in version 1, we have, like I said, over 60 CAN reports. One of them would be actually a task quick list, where we can pull up that, filter out by, for example, that sprint or that iteration, and show the closed items, which will have a strike through in version 1. And so now we can see all the tasks to this iteration for this project, and closed and open. You can also export this out to Excel if you need to. Any of the grids can be exported out to Excel.
Okay, so we actually have a follow-up question to the one we talked about before about putting in the details. The question was also around how to communicate the daily Scrum and collaboration, but where to record the details when the developers need to know more about what the requirements are in the user stories. Where do these story details live?
Okay, well, in version 1, typically, if you're working manually, those details go on like the back of the index card. If you don't really want to have so much that you can't put in the back of an index card, but you can also have a repository for any kind of additional documentation. In version 1, you can actually have attachments and links to, for example, wikis or to screenshots and attachments, of documentation to the actual story or to the task and to the task. And also in terms of collaboration, we collaborate in our stand-ups. That is crucial to an Agile environment. However, we do have collaboration efforts in the tool where we can send each other messages, especially for distributed teams. We can maintain discussion threads to each of these features or these user stories or tasks and tests, and we can actually set up subscription feeds for when we want to know if something's been changed.
Okay. Do you recommend using feature groups in categorizing user stories? If so, could you show how you might do this in version 1?
Yeah, absolutely. Feature groups to me, feature groups are often thought of as themes. And we do have feature groups available in version 1. And those feature groups, for my demo data, I actually have kind of functional groupings for software application. And what feature groups allow you to do in version 1 is slice and dice the data even more granularly. For example, if I'm in my backlog and I want to focus, as a product owner, I want to focus only on, let's say, order management features, and rank those, then I can go ahead and filter out in version 1 to see only order management features. Go ahead and rank those and push those through to the team as a mandate, send the team a notice or something, say, hey, we want to focus on order management. So any one of these grids in version 1 can be filtered out by the feature group. Now, work items or stories and defects in version 1 have a one-to-one relationship to feature groups, so to avoid duplicity. So I wanted to make that note. All
right, so we have a question here around, again, using a tool, and it says, even with our best efforts, our Scrum Master doesn't always close out tasks when they're done. Is it easy to go back into the version 1 tool and close those out, or do you have issues with date limitations?
Well, okay, yeah, so in version 1, the important metric to maintain when you're closing out a task is to making sure that the detail estimate is burnt down to 0 on the appropriate day. You can actually close that task on any day, because the close date, as long as it happens within that iteration, doesn't really matter. What matters in terms of your metrics or your burn down is when you burn it down. So the key is to be able to burn down on the appropriate day and close it whenever it's been accepted. But you cannot in version 1 since it's a real-time tool, and because of data integrity and because of Agile integrity, we do not allow you to go back and change dates in backdated.
Okay. So we have a question on what is the difference between a use case and a user story.
Okay, so I love this one because, yeah, when I was requirements manager, I dealt with use cases. Use cases are very high-level feature documents that have usually a functional specification, a design spec, a software requirement spec, all this documentation attached to it. And at some point in time, through all that documentation, you break a use case down into requirements. A user story would be probably what in traditional methodologies we call a requirement. So you equate a use case to an epic in Agile, and then epic breaks down into user stories. Okay, so and then Waterfall we have a use case that breaks down into requirements.
So the next question also is, what's an epic?
Okay, so an epic is it's a very high level user story. So let's say, for example, remember that example I was giving you that I created that user story. Let me put my filters in here just to make some more room here. But I created that user story for user documentation, and I know that that is a. Oops, I want to see stories, not defects. So I created that story for user documentation. It's really big. I made it 100 points because that involves a lot of work. That none of which can be completed, or some of it can be completed in one iteration. So in version 1, we can break that down into an epic. What that means is we're going to create stories or child stories underneath this story. And an example would be, so what's involved in user documentation? Well, perhaps a quick start guide. And that probably has an estimate of maybe a 2. And you can go ahead and put your user story in here for that quick start guide, because now we're actually making user stories again. And what else is involved? Perhaps an API guide. And we can give that, a 4 perhaps. And what else do we have? We have perhaps a user guide. Now, that's probably going to be, let's say, a 10. But as we're thinking about it, and as the team's collaborating and talking to the product owner, we say, product owner, I'm a technical writer, and I can't write a user guide in 2 weeks. We have 2 weeks sprint, so we can break that down even further in version 1. In other words, we're creating a hierarchy of epics. Let's say we're going to do the install section, and that'll be a 2. And let's create one more here under user guide. Let's say the admin section, and make that a 2. So now you notice we have this hierarchy building. The icons of the book means it's an epic, and underneath the icon you see underneath the epics you see the icons of the stories. When we go back to our backlog, notice now that I have those stories that I've created, but I don't show user documentation anymore. I just show the stories I created under it. However, if I ever wanted to keep track at the high level of those epics, then I can go to epics in version 1 and keep track of the progress of the epic and see the roll-up of what everything, of the cost of that epic, basically, because the estimate usually turns out to be cost anyway.
Okay, we've got a lot more questions around kind of sprint and release planning. So how are defects addressed in sprint planning?
So defects are treated the same as user stories. In version 1, you notice we have different icons. The red icons are those for defects or bugs. So they're, you've heard me use the term work items because I'm referring to both defects and user stories. And they're treated equally. The product owner is still managing these defects and ranking them. If a defect comes in that needs to be fixed right away in this next sprint, oh, wrong address on the invoice, I can go ahead and check it, and I'm going to move it to the top of the list to make sure it's ranked to get fixed on, immediately or in the next sprint. And sometimes, though, we understand the contract between the product owner and the team is to, once the team commits to work and the product owner accepts that, not to introduce anything else during that sprint. That is the Agile mandate. But let's be real, okay? Let's be real. Let's say we have 2-week sprints. We just put out a release and we find, a couple of bugs that need to be fixed. Sometimes that happens. So it's up to the team at that point to introduce that defect and re-rank the backlog. Keep in contact with that product owner, because sometimes you might have to kick something out depending on your velocity, and deal with that.
The next question we have is around, do you estimate that all backlog items in a release up front?
That is a corporate culture question. So from my experience, it is not a good idea to try to estimate the entire product backlog. Having said that, we recognize and we realize, I mean, let's be realistic and let's understand that executive management or a client wants to know, you know, we have this time box and when can we complete these features. So you have to have a rough estimate. But realistically, looking that far out, you know, whatever you say is not going to be correct anyway because things change. So I would recommend, and I think the best practice is not to estimate until you get to release planning at the very earliest, to do your formal estimates. You know, depending on how long your releases are, if you're releasing it, you know, annually, that doesn't help you either. So I would create some child releases underneath there. And I think that's a good place to do your estimating. Some teams actually estimate in sprint planning, and that's how we do it. That's how marketing does it. And so that's appropriate too if you're ongoing. You know, if you have a production instance, for example, where it doesn't matter the time box, you're always going to be in there.
So the next question again follows those lines. When is sprint planning usually done? Is it the first day of the sprint or the tail end of the previous sprint?
It is the first day. By definition, sprint planning is the beginning of your sprint, and review is or retrospective. If you do retrospective, is the end of your sprint. So your sprint encompasses 3 stages: planning, actual development, and you know your software development lifecycle, and then your review and retrospective if you do the retrospective.
We have an easy question here. It says, we use Team Foundation Server to track tasks. Will version 1 integrate with TFS? If so, which version?
It does, and what I recommend doing is, okay, so let's go to the support site real quick to find that out, because off the top of my head, I don't know.
It's the latest version.
It's okay. You see, it's the latest version. Marketing people know. So yes, we do integrate with TFS. I would recommend we'll put up some information to, you know, we'll finish answering questions to where you can contact somebody to talk about maybe perhaps getting into eval with that.
Okay. So the next one is, I'm intrigued on how the ideas tab would link to stories. Could you demonstrate if you can?
I don't have, okay, I can demonstrate. The data is not going to match, because what I'm going to show you, I'm actually going to go to version 1 ideas, which we call it idea space. And those of you who aren't familiar, idea space is your outlet to offer us feature requests and vote for those feature requests. And as you can see, we have, you know, quite a few ideas, quite a few votes. You can actually see when those feature requests are actually grabbed and planned on, and which ones have been completed. You can see what's hot, what's top. So let's say I was linked to this idea space, which I'm not. In version 1, I have, you notice I have my ideas tab. What that gives me is, excuse me. Let me get to that. Oh, I'm sorry about the technical difficulty. I don't know what's taking so long here. So anyway, the ideas tab is going to give me basically a backlog of all the ideas that are in that website, and additional information. I can go ahead and customize that grid again to add and remove whatever is important to me. And I can go ahead and change the status. We have several statuses: planned, candidate, and I believe completed currently. Now, so you manage these ideas in version 1, and say you have a feature that you have planned, which means that basically now it's a user story. So you can go ahead and generate a user story from that feature and put it directly into the backlog. It maintains the history of where that came from, the original idea, you know, a description where you can create your user story from. So it's a great outlet. We use it internally and externally, and we have quite a few customers who are using it right now. Another plug for Idea Space is that you can actually customize the GUI in Idea Space with your own logo, your own colors.
And if you want to get more information, you go on the version 1 website.
You can go to the version 1 website to get more information.
All right, we are pretty much out of time right now. We do have several more questions that we will address offline and follow up with people directly. So thank you all for your time today. Thank you, Tapia, for the presentation. Any other parting words, and I'll leave that to you.
If you want to talk to anybody here more about best practices around user stories, you know, regardless of whether you want to look at the tool, please give us a call. send us an email, and we'd be happy to. I love talking best practices all day long. And also, we do have some information up here about our sales organization if you're interested in the actual tool to get to the evaluation or some training through version 1.
Thank you all very much.